Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
I am Mark Ragan. I have a company in Chicago called Ragan Communications. I'm a relatively new Coloradan. I moved here about 7 or 8 years ago. You can divide my life into 3 different careers. I was a political reporter covering the White House under Bush and Clinton. Then I have a business in Chicago. It's a corporate communications business. We advise people who message both employees and the outside world, corporate communications. And then my third career, after I came to Colorado, I took over the Boulder Ensemble Theater Company in Boulder. So that's where the nonprofit comes in. And I wanted to ask the panel here to introduce themselves. We'll go right down the row. And in addition to introducing themselves, I want you to tell me what you think the biggest challenges facing nonprofits today, and I want you to give me a secret tip. It can be small and it can be very large. That's up to you. Yes, go ahead.
My name's Dean Sobel. I am currently the Associate Professor of the Practice of Art History and Museum Studies at the University of Denver. But the real reason I think I'm here, or I'm just a lowly professor, the real reason I'm here is I have enjoyed a roughly 30-some year career in art museums, various types of art museums, most recently as the founding director of a single artist museum, the Clifford Still Museum in Denver. So having entered the field in the late 80s, I've witnessed what I think is a kind of enormous and not always positive transformation of the museum industry. Probably when I began in the late 80s, museums, many were still city-funded. Institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art still receive a large portion of funding from their local municipalities. But that, for a variety of reasons, the unpredictability of city governments has started a trend probably in the 70s and into the 80s where art museums have privatized. So we are now in the position of not counting on any support from or very little support from our city and state governments. And then we get to the very delicate issue of federal funding. And I wanted to mention very, very quickly this panel is rather relevant to things I've been experiencing this week. The University of Denver School of Art and Art History brought Karen Finley, who's a performance artist, kind of a legendary performance artist who gained a lot of notoriety as part of the NEA4, who actually had their federal grants from the National Endowment rescinded during that first culture war, if you remember, in the first George Bush administration, late 80s and early 90s. And they actually sued the federal government and lost over questions of decency. But I think that's an interesting place to begin. And I think what would probably say one of my biggest challenges running an art museum today is in fact the funding sources, getting away from those government sources or even what might be invested income sources, endowments and so forth, toward the reliance on the ultra wealthy. And so probably throughout our remarks in the next hour, we'll touch on things like toxic philanthropy, the Sacklers, Purdue Pharma, things like that. But those are really the critical key, along with the larger reckoning, I think, of the art museum community into having more equity, probably less reliance on building collections and capital expansions, which was a huge thing in the 80s and 90s, towards a more equitable, just organization and so forth. My only real trick or tip isn't anything new at all. I think in every aspect of profit and nonprofit management, it's about relationship building. In art museums, we're very, very good at taking people on trips trips abroad. I took a group to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and saw all that's happening there. Talk about funding sources, that's oil. And there's a very interesting thing we could talk about there. But of course, going to the art fairs and visiting artist studios, it's really the way I think in museums we get to form those very unique and very, I think mission-centered activities of the artworks and the reasons we do what we do. So that's maybe a very broad brushstrokes, and I'm anxious to maybe hone in on some of those a little more.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dean. My name is Maya. I'm the Director of School Engagement in the Arts at the 92nd Street Y. And for those of you who don't know, 92NY is a community and cultural organization located on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. We just turned 150 years old this year, been around for a long time. My department creates arts education programs for K through 12 public students and their teachers across the 5 boroughs, and to some extent nationally through online offerings. And through our programs, students interact with the world-class talent that comes to the Y on a day-to-day basis. They learn from expert teaching artists in their school residencies. They have access to professional internships with us. So we do a lot, and all of that is very, very deeply reliant on grants from, federal grants to individual donations. Those contributions allow us to offer significant subsidies to the schools that are lower resourced to be able to participate at the cost they're able to do so. And allow us to remain financially healthy. So I think that's why I'm here to some extent. I guess I would, jump off of what you're saying, Dean, which is just the stark reality that, we've seen the Department of Cultural Affairs has been reduced by more than $25 million over the past 2 rounds of budget cuts. But I think from a more psychological lens, I've just been thinking a lot about the sort of scarcity mindset when it comes to the ways organizations think about other peer organizations. There's just feels like there's this competition for grants, for individual funders, in addition to, competition for participants in their programs, audience members, et cetera, since of course there's tons of crossover and wonderful crossover, in our city. And that's not a surprise, but I think that there's a real opportunity for coalition building between culturals to uplift each other and each other's programs. And so I'm really interested in trends and opportunities that promote more inclusive and sustainable and efficient practices in philanthropy. And I think community-centric funding is one of those that we've seen on the rise, which is wonderful, which relies on a cross-organizational collaboration and a sharing of resources. So shifting power back to communities and thinking about the ways in which organizations, like-minded organizations with similar missions, can come together to create something really special and leverage each other's strengths.
Thank you. John?
Great. Thank you, Mark, and it's great to be here. I love coming to this conference. It's the 3rd year in a row that I've been here, and I always look forward to it. Well, I come from sort of a different perspective. I am now the founder and president of a foundation called the Foundation for Systemic Change, and one of the reasons why I created this foundation was to fund projects that are involved in creating systemic change, because for so long I had been on the other side working to change things, but none of it seemed to stick. And I'm convinced that part of the reason, or the primary reason, is because the philanthropy that drives that is based on quick fixes rather than long-term sustainable systemic change. So I am here as a donor, but I've spent 4 decades on the other side, on my knees begging for funding in various capacities. I started off as a humanitarian aid worker for the International Rescue Committee, and working and running programs in Sudan and then in Bosnia. And in that capacity had to raise money largely from the US government, USAID, as well as from the UN. And then I moved on to Washington, D.C., and created an organization that was funded by George Soros. So that was my introduction to the foundation world. And then I'm not reciting my resume for the heck of it. This is all related to funding. I worked for Physicians for Human Rights and did all of their investigations in Afghanistan and other places, and largely that was, I had to go out and seek that funding largely from foundations, and then I was at the U.S. Holocaust Museum running their Committee on Conscience. Most of the money that funds the U.S. Holocaust Museum comes from the federal government, but any type of programmatic activity, and my section of the museum was designed to report on early warning signs in potential genocidal situations around the world. So we had to raise money there, and that was interesting because a big chunk of funds coming to the Holocaust Museum was coming from planned giving, which I would love to talk about too, because I think it has a lot of relevance as we get older and older. And then I, for 10 years, ran Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and that was primarily an introduction to high net worth individuals that had connections to the Kennedys and others. And then I created the foundation. But so it gave me an opportunity to see where a lot of this funding came from. As I said, I think philanthropy writ large needs a huge paradigm shift. And my tip is, and it's sort of, you know, my tip is, and at least in the sort of the human rights community, humanitarian, social justice raising funds, is to find something where you can get the constituencies that make these decisions, whether it be boards of foundations or whether it be voters in the United States, that you know, you're the person controlling the purse strings for US aid, you know, eventually are your elected officials, and they have to be dependent on their constituents, and so they want something tangible that they can hold on to. So it's those quick fixes that I think shouldn't happen, that, you know, at least in the human rights world, is what a lot of these funders are looking for.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind anyone, if you have any questions, just raise your hand anytime during this session, and someone will come over with a note card, and then they'll pass those note cards up to me. So anytime, doesn't matter when during the session. Couple of things that I like to talk to folks when they come into the room, and someone suggested to me a really interesting trend, that what has happened in a lot of giving is that has gone from giving by the masses, which we're seeing in the political world a lot. I'm sure you've read about that so many donations today to politicians come in $25 bits, but they add up to an enormous sum of money. Well, the person I was talking to was saying that in our world of nonprofits, it's gone the other way, that it's all about high net worth individuals. So I wanted to first, Maya, maybe you could respond to this, because I know you worked for development at one time at the 92nd Street Y. Can you say whether that is true for you or not?
I mean, I do think it's true to some extent. You know, so I was in development at the Public Theater, and certainly,
I'm sorry,
no,
Public
that's okay,
Theater,
that's
yeah.
okay. I work with development at the Y all the time. Sometimes I feel like I work in development, writing all these grants, but I think that, look, it's a combination. I'll give an example. I mean, I think that there are ways in which the kind of democratization of smaller gifts, we're seeing it, you know, working in the political space. Actually, at the Y, few people I think know this, the Y was the birthplace of Giving Tuesday, which, for those of you who don't know, is the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving, and it's recognized as the day to contribute to charities and nonprofits. You know, and we see millions of dollars, many millions of dollars coming in across the board. So honing in on moments and stories and narratives that speak to the greater public, and, you know, leveraging those stories to really galvanize donations. I've seen work in a variety of settings, both at the Public and at the Y. That being said, of course, you know, there's always the focus on the, you know, high net worth individuals, and I think I'm seeing that trend grow more and more, I would say. I think, you know, the nuances of that are anything but straightforward, and I think probably both of these wonderful people can speak more to those, again, individual relationships and cultivations. I think that, you know, we in the arts and culture space have certainly had a great reckoning with, what that means in terms of attaching our name as an institution and building trust with the public around individuals. The Sackler family's story is certainly one of those. And then there are, of course, so many wonderful individuals who are, the lifeblood of the Y, who are patrons, and who also happen to be in the position of giving a lot of money to the organization. So, it really runs the gamut, I think. I don't think it's a simple answer. I don't know if you have anything to
Can
add.
either one of you want to take that question of whether or not you've seen a shift from mass giving to high donor individuals? Has that happened in your organization?
I mean, if I were to add maybe a slight nuance to that, and particularly for museums, and I don't think art museums are necessarily unique, but the business model for museums is pretty flawed, and particularly art museums, where only 3 to 7% of institutions' budget actually comes from what we'll call ticket sales. The admission tickets you buy to get in, and that's quite different compared to performing arts institutions where, in art museums, and they've gone up remarkably over the last 10 years, but it used to be $10, let's say, maybe it's 25 or 35 at some of the larger museums, but that doesn't compare at all to performing arts groups. And I'm not saying performing arts
Ours
groups
is
shouldn't
25,
do that. Well, good, but I've paid $250 for a theater ticket, and I don't know what sporting events go for, or some of these other forms of leisure time activities. But what's been interesting about that is because it contributes so little to the institution's bottom line, we're asking ourselves, why are we charging at all? Because there is a barrier to entry by that admission. And then oftentimes how we figure out how to achieve that free admission is we ask the ultra wealthy person to make an endowment gift, who will then fund free admission for whatever perpetuity is these days, 20 years or something. And so it sort of plays it from both ends. But I guess I'll leave again is the business model of nonprofits, especially given our high aspirations. Good thing we're nonprofits, because you can't make any money doing it. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with that is, and I don't know whether that's a trend or not, but sometimes, obviously it depends on what you're raising money for, and if it's a particular cause, sometimes that mass funding can be helpful. But ultimately, I think what we all want as people running nonprofits is a diverse source of funding that comes from foundations, that comes from high net worth individuals, that come from mass funding, and that can be difficult. I'm the board chair of an organization called Disability Rights for, or Disability. I live with so many acronyms. DRI, Disability Rights International. Anyway, they do wonderful work all over the world, exposing the way largely kids with disabilities are institutionalized and so on and so forth. And they have diversified their funding base largely because they get foundation funds, and ultimately you want those funds to be unrestricted, right? You want to be able to do whatever you want with those funds. I think that's the goal. But they also have a fairly robust funding base that comes from people who are attached to that cause, that people either have family members or they themselves are living with a disability. So if it's a cause-related organization, I sometimes think that the idea of attracting a high net worth individual can be that much more compelling.
I wanted to add very quickly that the IRS code for the public charity test does require a sort of diversity of funding. You can't have more than 30%. And in the art museum field, again, we have all these new private museums, which are really private foundations. They're getting the Broad Museum, if any of you know what that is in Los Angeles, maybe the most popular art museum on the West Coast.
That's expanding.
Yeah, that's now going to build another building next door, and that's an interesting model of why that's been so popular. But it doesn't qualify for the normal tax-exempt status that the IRS lays over most organizations. So I think that's
I'll just give one example. I'm the executive producer of a film that's connected to my foundation as well, about the role that grassroots organizing has played in this country and needs to continue to play, in telling the story of this guy called Fred Ross, who trained Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and others, and myself much later. on how to be a grassroots organizer. And initially what we did is we went out and we, did crowdsourcing and got a, pretty significant amount of money, and then we were able to attract a lot of labor support and foundation support. But that was very directly related to this cause, per se.
Sorry.
Just
to
for,
add
go ahead.
one more thing. I think when we're talking about, cultivating and stewardship, cultivation and stewardship, the thing maybe missing from the conversation so far is also the mid-level donors. Investing in maybe the younger donor who's 30 and is able to contribute, a couple $1,000s, but is growing their career, and also is really interested in being a part of community. A trend I've seen growing in nonprofits and cultural spaces is that community building work to, in the cultivation landscape to, host opportunities for like-minded professionals who are making donations to come together, to see events together, and to grow that base to think about, we're making an investment in these relationships for the next decade, multiple decades. So that's another trend I've seen, which I think is really important to consider, is bringing in those younger donors.
Just to add to that, I was the director of the Aspen Art Museum here in Colorado between 2000 and 2005, and at that time, and I haven't been as close to it recently, the boards of the Art Museum, the Aspen Music Festival, Aspen Meadows, Aspen Institute, the ballet, were all 75-year-old men and women. And I think there's been an acute awareness of exactly what you're talking about, is who will replace those donors at that same level. And I think it's still very challenging.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, actually.
I just attended a wonderful presentation Bank of America sponsored a few days ago, and on the Lilly study, which is apparently a very well-known study that looks at all the giving trends year to year. And the thing that was most startling to me coming from performing arts was that, I think it was put very bluntly, that when it comes to the performing arts and millennials have zero interest in giving to the performing arts, which really got my attention, considering the demographic bump. Now, do you think that's true, or is that an exaggeration? Is that an anomaly in the numbers?
Do you know the Placacoan, the market research folks? There's a nonprofit market research group, but it's interesting, something that we study very closely, is that millennials and others, it's not the traditional experience of going to a single activity. It's what you define as a cultural activity, and some people feel going to a restaurant or watching PBS or, gosh, I don't know, some other of those things maybe many of us would question, but it's that combination of activities. So all the restaurants or the behind the scenes things that you could tack on to a cultural activity seems to be, what the research is showing seems to be a possible way to attract those. But just buying a ticket and sitting down and going home, paying the babysitter isn't quite the model anymore. And it's been fascinating. And sometimes as someone who's maturing in their career, it's eye-opening how different things
Mark and I, we were talking about this before in terms of the arts, and Dean, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because I don't know anything about it. But is the role that the arts traditionally has played in my generation and the generations above me in terms of kind of an entree into society and establishment, and you are a philanthropist and therefore you're going to support such and such museum and so on and so forth, that perhaps is not as valuable for somebody who is 30 or 40 years old who has a lot of money.
But as a mid-donor, it's that laddering up the development.
But what I was also going to say is, in terms of sort of young donors, and this reminded me a little bit of what I did at the Holocaust Museum, as well as I did at RFK Human Rights, is we really sort of focused on two different constituencies. Those people who were in their, let's say for instance, RFK Human Rights, who were 75 years old, who knew exactly where they were when Robert F. Kennedy was killed, and how that was kind of a seminal moment in their life. And what we did is we developed this planned giving program for those people who were thinking about, what they would do when they, with their money when they died. Similarly with the Holocaust Museum, where planned giving was huge, but we were also focused on those people who were, high net worth individuals in their 30s and early 40s who were trying to figure out their philanthropy.
Right.
And so cultivating them at that point so that eventually, and this was sort of a long-term strategic plan, eventually these people are going to be in their 70s and 80s and die, and how can we convert that interest into a planned giving plan as well?
I wanted to shift focus, but first I wanted to ask for just show of hands on some of the topics that we've discussed already. First of all, how many of you represent nonprofits in any way, either as a volunteer or, excellent. So could I ask for a show of hands, how many of you have seen this trend where, how many of you are in the performing arts? Is anybody in the performing arts? Would you say that trend is correct, that millennials don't necessarily want to give as much to the performing arts as, say, climate change organizations? Raise your hands if you think that's correct. Are you seeing any of that? Okay, good. Could I also get a show of hands of just a simple question, is your giving up or down? How many people have giving that is going up? Oh, congratulations. And down? Anyone down? Okay, great. I'd like to move a little bit to two things. I'd like to shift to technology for a second. And what I mean by that, don't worry, no tech questions. It's more about storytelling, and it's more about practical fundraising. Let me start with the practical side. I was at a fundraiser last night for the Dairy Arts Center. Now, was anybody else there last night? Yeah. And I was stunned, because if you took me back 5 years ago and went to the same fundraiser, we would have had a paddle raise. How many of you have witnessed a paddle raise? They're horrible. I mean, people hate them, people feel trapped, all of those things. Last night, there's no paddle raise. There actually was no verbal ask for money. What there was the technology where people could just tweet throughout the evening contributions. And when I left, and I left an hour before it ended, they were at $180,000. And this was just people going from room to room, looking at various arts organizations performing, and if they liked it, and at the spur of the person leading them, they would give money. And I thought that was fascinating. How many of you have seen that in your nonprofit in terms of digital fundraising taking off? That's interesting. Okay. How many of you have gone the other way and you've tried digital fundraising and it hasn't really worked for you? Okay. And the panel? Anybody want to?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. It's, embedded in so much of what we're doing now in terms of fundraising. And, it makes sense. It's intuitive. I mean, I was, recently actually at another organization's benefit fundraiser, but we do a similar thing where, it was a really beautiful series of performances that, of course, captured the heart and mind in the moment. And then on the side, you had a QR code. And you could just, at the end, pop open your phone, scan that QR code, and give a gift. So, there is an ease to transactions now that I think digital giving, allows, that I'm seeing everywhere. And then also on the sort of side of smaller donations, a trend on many sites that I'm seeing are just when you're checking out in your cart, there's an opportunity to add $10 or whatever it is to the donation, and that just builds right in. So I think we're seeing it on all scales, certainly.
So related to this, somebody in our audience asked a question that's perfectly suited for this conversation. Do high donors need expensive, flashy fundraising events? Can't that money go directly to the nonprofits? Does anybody want to speak to flashy events?
I've talked to donors who will pay you to not go to another black tie event. I mean, I'm being quite serious too. But especially in New York or large communities.
It's where the paddle raise.
Or in Aspen, where all these things happened in the high season of summer, or maybe Christmas. Within 10 days and Christmas week and July and August in Aspen, they were all raising funds, and you were going out 2 or 3 times a week. To the question you initially asked about this technology, I can't help but think of COVID, when in museums and across the board, the tendency to rely on benefits and parties to raise money for our operations has proven to be very complicated. And during COVID, I guess we all sort of were shut down by March. A lot of people had their benefits in April or in May, and that 10% or sometimes 20% or even larger in small organizations. The Dairy Center, I wonder how much they raised for their whole operating budget last night. The ability to do it another way, you know, whether you're at home or at the event, and I even wonder if this could even be possibility, you know, during the performance itself, at the very end of the last act or something. That, you know, it's really interesting, and I wasn't aware of that. This is all new to me.
Yeah, and I really was struck by the difference of only 2 or 3 years ago. So
Yeah.
I wonder if the
I
pandemic
think COVID has
really-
changed it.
Yeah. That's a really
saying
good
anything
point.
new.
I think the flashy event maybe is, you know, is a thing of the past unless you have an organization that's been doing this for years and years and years, and you have the kind of this established clientele. I used to run this organization called the Business Council for the UN that would try to convince businesses throughout the country that the UN was a valuable organization focusing on the environment or refugees and or whatever. But we raised about 90% of our operating budget at a huge gala every year at the Waldorf Astoria at the opening of the General Assembly, where we bring together the ambassadors and the business community who would pay to sit with the ambassadors. And it was fascinating because it was, you know, each year you could kind of see what were the trends were internationally. So someone would pay 1 year a lot of money to sit with the Chinese ambassador, and then the following year after Tiananmen Square, nobody, the ambassador, China was sitting on the third tier of the Waldorf Astoria, you know, gala. But we did this at RFK Human Rights. You know, a huge portion of our budget was provided by a gala every year. But I think largely because it was this established thing, it was a generational thing. Probably you didn't have a bunch of young people there. But then you also, you know, there were big names in the room that you wanted to sit with, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really kind of probably an age-related thing. But
I cynically called them the bus trips and bake sales.
Yeah.
The way we raised our money, you know, in you know, the trips I talk about, maybe it's a you know, a 787 taking you to buy, but these special event and this event income, which are very expensive too, you know, to do these galas with, you know, the best caterers and the performing artists.
Just
and,
the space alone.
Yeah, and the space rentals and the staff suck too.
Yeah.
I mean, how much
Can
work
I-
they are on.
I want to
staff,
switch
yeah.
real quickly because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to go across a variety of subjects. But sticking with technology, from another technological perspective, I want to talk about storytelling and how important is storytelling to raising money and to operating nonprofits and to creating trust. And my example of this came years ago. I'm a conference producer, as I said, in Chicago. And one of our most popular speakers was the founder of Charity Water. Does anybody know Charity Water? Anybody in the room know Charity Water? And I'll never forget, he told a story that the first person he ever hired, this was a guy who used to own nightclubs in New York, and one day just had an awakening and decided that he was going to change his life and start drilling for clean water in Africa. And it has become one of the most successful nonprofits in the history of the world. And it's all, his first hire was a storyteller. His first hire, the first person he ever hired was someone who was a videographer and storyteller. And so I'm going to start with you, Maya, and I want to ask, what is the importance of storytelling at the 92nd Street Y? How do you do it, and how do you measure it?
It's everything. I mean, it really is. We, you know, we literally take up a city block of New York City, and within that city block is a gym, a pool, a nursery school, a world-class dance center, a 900-seat concert hall that hosts music concerts, a world-famous talks series. So we are always figuring out ways to comprehensively tell our story, both on a larger scale of how all of those things coalesce to become, you know, one mission-driven body, but also you know, to identify folks who really want to get involved with one specific area of the work. And, you know, I have to say that we have an incredible team of copywriters, videographers, you know, web editors on our marketing team who spend a lot of time doing exactly this. But what I'll say is, I mean, it really works. I was at the gala last year, and there was a 3-minute video that just blew my mind because it captured 150 years of history and all of the different departments in such a human way, and both covered the big but also honed in on very specific individual unique stories of how the Ys impacted folks' lives. I think about I looked up the word philanthropy and was reminded that it comes from Greek words, philein, which is love, and anthropos, which is human. And so I think, again, that how do we cultivate love and humanity in our storytelling? I think that's essential to the lifeblood of any organization and sustaining it. Yeah.
I see a lot of people taking notes out there, which is a good sign, because I do believe that content is the secret sauce. I just wanted to, before I go on, to have the other panelists expand on this. With Charity Water that I mentioned, they were so creative in how they used technology that if you invested in a well, they actually had a GPS device and a camera so that you could actually log in from anywhere in the world and see villagers in Africa getting the water from your well. Now that is content. That is, you want a direct relationship between the money you give and the cause, that's it. Did you want to comment on the museum's content operation?
Yeah, it is interesting. In exhibition design, we think about what we call exhibitionary moments, a kind of narrative arc, and the way you can create vistas with individual works. And the technologies, I think, especially, even though they're not always inexpensive, there are ways to bring in audio, video sources. And one of the models I think that we used and were very impressed by was podcasting. And I think they're called driveway moments, where you won't turn off your car, you don't get out of the car until the story is over. That there's a number of ways through storytelling that you can create these, impactful experiences. This is something we talked about on another panel, that go much further than the simple, kind of binary painting and text panel, painting and text panel. So I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of good that has come out of that.
How many of you are using content right now to keep in touch with your donors and your key constituencies? Okay.
And then it all could go online too. That's the other thing. Our websites have become now these archives of this content.
Right.
I agree. Storytelling is crucial. And I think we've seen an evolution of it, and this is a while back, but and there's been obviously a lot of studies what motivates people to give and so on and so forth. But if you're working in an organization, and this has been most of my career, where you're trying to affect some sort of behavioral change, whether it's stopping war or the abuse of people with disabilities or whatever, rather than sort of tell the grand story on a macro level of what your organization is doing, is to focus on that one individual. And that's been proven over and over, and we see it in advertisements and on TV and other places, just how valuable that can be, because otherwise it can be so damn overwhelming. But that one person and what impact your organization has had on that
emotional connection, I think that's kind of a key part of that.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk, we have a question here from the audience. Thoughts on membership models for sustainable revenue. John was talking about thinking in the long term, not quick fixes. And what about tangible benefits for members? So the whole idea is you create a membership in your organization, but in order to get people to give, to be a member, there have to be benefits. So does anybody want to take a crack at membership models?
Very quickly, when we certain institutions drop admission, which was one of the real benefits of museum membership, is you got in free and could go as often as you want. There's been a lot of sharing of information and realizing that many people use the membership because they do want to support the organization, or at least in a perfect world. But I think that's raised and heightened this question of what do potential members or existing members value? And certainly in art museums, many of you are aware of this, the reciprocal memberships, which museums are joining together. There's several different consortiums, the big guys and others, and some won't even participate. MoMA will never give away an admission. But that's become very valuable, because we know with cultural tourism, if you can go and see another museum in a town you're visiting for free, that may be the most valuable to many of our members and many others.
Maya, do you have any kind of membership model at 96?
Yes, we have a variety of membership models, bundle bundle deals for, joining a series of events within a season. And those certainly, we gain traction both in terms of, again, we're a community center, cultivating community, bringing folks into the fold. I think oftentimes, again, people know us for one thing that we do and don't know about another thing, so that's a way to cultivate a relationship. The other thing I will name that's been an interesting discovery is that in terms of tangible sort of benefits, emphasis on tangible, there's been a real interest in actual physical giveaways, which I think maybe is a surprise given, the digitalized world that we're in, but a signed book, a signed poster, a lot of people are signing up for talks where, they get to see their hero, Jane Goodall, and having those physicalized like memories of the experience, which is so deeply human and personal, has really been quite popular. So I think that's an interesting takeaway.
One of the key things I think with membership models, because we have one at the Boulder Ensemble Theater Company, is what are you going to give away, and how do you do it so it doesn't cost you, right? So if you give away membership to increase, say, subscriptions to the season, you want to give something of value away, but you got to be careful that it isn't costing you. So we leverage technology. So we, for example, will have the director do a webinar before the opening and say, if you are a subscriber, you get free access to this webinar. Just one example. I want to shift topics really quickly to, this is a big one. Speaking about the reduction in government spending, you mentioned, I believe, Maya, 25% cut.
25 million, yes, in the past 2 years.
To support groups dependent on philanthropy. Compare the U.S. to European countries in terms of the way European countries support the arts. Does anybody want to take a crack at that?
I think it's Europe, at least Western Europe, I think has, for a variety of political and economic and other reasons, has been lowering their public support, is my understanding of it. I mean, when I got into the field, and it's interesting when you go to, I think especially Germany, all the Kunsthalles and at Kunstvereins, in every little municipality there was, and to some extent there still is, a somewhat government-funded institution, but I think that's changing.
And with that, has there been a rise in private support?
As I understand it, but again, in Europe, I mean, British Petroleum is a good example. Tate and Tate Modern, have been widely criticized, I think, especially in England. But it's being replaced by corporate, and then the model we use here is major individuals, as I understand it, generally speaking.
All I can say is if you live in D.C., you're so spoiled because we have the Smithsonian, and you just assume that every museum is free, and then you go to some other place and you have to pay $20-25 again. It's like, what?
But they still raise money, though. I mean, they do.
They do.
They're very active fundraisers.
It's true in the theater world, too. I saw Ray Fiennes and Anthony and Cleopatra a few years ago at the National Theater. The ticket was $35. I went to see Cabaret last week in New York. The ticket was $650. So there's a little bit of difference in the approach. John, I didn't let you comment on that previous question about technology or content, or did you want to say anything about
No,
that?
I mean, obviously it's important, and it's increasingly important. But at the end of the day, and maybe this is sounding old-fashioned, but it's all about relationships, I think, and it's all about that stewardship of those relationships. A lot of organizations have a whole in their fundraising department, they have, people that just solely focus on stewardship and that one-on-one relationship. While technology is important, I think you can't substitute it with that one-on-one personal relationships that you develop.
So back to the government funding for a second. How many of you know about Ballot 2A in Boulder? Does anybody know about Ballot 2A? So Ballot 2A was this was citizens taking control, if you want to think about it. Ballot 2A was an initiative among arts organizations in Boulder, us included, to take what was an expiring tax and asked the citizens of Boulder if they would like to apportion some of that money to the arts. And it passed overwhelmingly. It passed. Is anybody in ballot 2A in the room here? I know Jan Burton is in another room, but I think it was 70%. I mean, it really, really succeeded among the population. And I wonder whether or not there is something there. Can we look to the future of going to our communities and our citizens and trying ballot initiatives?
Depends how you feel about tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many, anyone from the 7-county Metro Boulder is actually one of the 7 counties, SCFD, which is a national model that provides funding to now over 300 scientific and cultural facilities. Before COVID, they were distributing about $55 million. A good chunk of that went to the Big 6, mostly in Denver County. But that too, although I think the support's been dwindling, it has to be reauthorized every 15 years. And I want to say it may have been closer to 55%, but I think it was higher than that. It started in '89 and then every 15 years. So this may be up for its next reauthorization. But it's, that's a lot of capital to infuse into the districts with $55
It'd also be
million.
interesting to kind of discuss what strings are attached with that.
It's general operating. It's interesting.
What is it?
And you have to, it's a little more complicated. We don't have time to it, but it's not as easy as I'm making it sound. Yeah, there's a few other strings.
How about the ballot idea, though, the ballot initiative idea, where arts organizations group together and try to make their case? Have you been involved in anything like that?
I mean, not formally, but I think there's. I've mentioned my real interest in community-centric funding models, which I think are essential now more than ever, as we're seeing, these larger budget cuts across the board. Our department created an initiative called Teen Arts Week, which was a citywide festival in March that we basically worked with a consortium of about 30 major culturals and some smaller, newer, budding culturals as well, who basically the entry point was you have to offer an event and it has to be free for teens for a week. And I think that what we saw was real opportunities again to leverage each other's strengths, resources, and that's that gives back to the future kind of lifeblood of the cultural sort of ecosystem of New York. I think that's really a fundable model, and it supports many organizations. So I think those larger, bigger ideas that we can all, and by we I mean a consortium of institutions, can get behind, that speaks to a narrative that again motivates a city to make change. There's something there.
Another question related to government: how has the tax code changed to support or discourage giving? Does anyone here on the panel want to address that?
The lobbyists for the American Association of Museums, are very concerned about the deductibility of donations to nonprofits. But I don't know, again, and there must be some impact. But again, I think under changing, the Trump tax cuts, I think, changed just what small donations can do in terms of the standard deduction. But I know the lobbyists are very, very concerned about any changes to the deductibility of contributions to nonprofits. But again, people are motivated to give for different reasons.
Yeah.
But saving money, efficacy of the gift is important.
Yeah.
I hesitate to even bring this up because I don't know almost anything about it, but I'm seeing that cryptocurrency donations are on the rise, and part of that popularity is that it does reduce donors' tax obligations. So that's another area in which, again, I'm not an expert and not even really have basic understanding of, but that's something to throw out there for anybody who does.
John, are you a tax expert?
Oh my God, no, I'm not. And nor am I an expert on cryptocurrency, but that would be really interesting to know. So what you're saying, and I know you prefaced by saying, but that a donation through cryptocurrency gives you a greater tax break than just.
It's just a security. So
Right.
people have
yeah.
systematic
Got it.
gains and they're not
Yeah.
way to offset it, because most banks won't do like tax harvesting with cryptocurrency, so your only way to get a deduction is to use it as an in-kind donation. And get that.
Like gifts of stock, like a gift of stock.
so
Yeah,
it's
that's
like an
interesting.
in-kind,
Yeah, which
okay.
is the way most of those major gifts come through is as stock.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
The increase in the standard deduction, I was talking to this gentleman, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. What's your name? Doug was telling me some great stuff. Doug, do you mind just telling the folks what you told me?
So it is the standard deduction. It essentially doubled. And so if the average person now is no longer incentivized to write off and itemize their deductions, of which charitable giving was a big part that a lot of households used that deduction for. And so without doing that, I think it took a year or so, and people kind of realized there's no reason to keep all these receipts, and so they probably started giving less and less because they weren't keeping it for their tax purposes.
So did everybody hear that in the back? Did you hear that? I can repeat that for the cameras as well. Yes. The increase, the doubling of the standard deduction may have taken the attention off people who normally were used to itemizing their deductions for when they file their taxes. And when that attention came off of that, that may have resulted in a diminution of charitable giving. Am I describing that correctly? Yes. Well, maybe content could help solve that, right? Where we could come in and fill in the gap. I have to wrap it up in a few minutes, but I wanted to, here's a very, what's that?
This goes till 9:10.
Oh, okay.
For 10 minutes.
Okay. So how do you deal with, so I have more than a few minutes. How do you deal with the many donors that want to give but not get on the mailing list? Now this is I love these questions because they're highly practical.
Foundations are, I mean, I've experienced that mostly with foundations. Stop sending me all this stuff. What do you, would you agree?
Yeah, I don't think being on the mailing list is as important as it was at one point. And I serve as a board chair on a couple of organizations, and we always debate the value of your annual giving letter that goes
Yeah,
out.
you
I
must
think at
send
one
it out.
point it was really, I remember, 30, 40 years ago, this was key, and your constituents, expected that letter to arrive. I mean, I'm sure there's studies, and there's sure there's data on this, but I tend to think it's certainly not as important as it once was.
I suspect there's less mailing going on too. A lot of
Yeah.
museums stopped
Yeah.
doing their members' newsletters. It's very expensive to produce and then ultimately mail. Going back to your membership question, it was my understanding most lower level memberships are break even or even money losing propositions because of some of those expenses. So if it's coming to you via email or other electronic ways, it's probably easier to get off it than.
And I think sometimes it has a negative effect, particularly, it depends on who you are, but if you get some, glossy magazine arriving in your mail, on the one hand, it's beautiful, aesthetically pleasing and everything else, but you have to think, damn, how much did it cost to produce that?
Yeah.
And where should that money be going in terms of overhead and other things? I think there's much more of a focus on that now. I'm even to the extent, I remember when I was running an organization, we wanted to move offices in DC, and the office that we moved to was much nicer than the previous office, and I thought, is this going to be something that a donor is going to like or not like? If you're going to walk through that door and see a really nice office, you're thinking, is this really where I want my money to be going toward? So.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to give you my background. Oh, I'm sorry. Mike,
No,
go
no,
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think certainly the trend has been to digital, email, things being available online so that folks can opt in to read or not read. And I mean, the immense suck on staff time. I mean, when I was working in development back in 2012, I mean, it was so much of us just doing these massive mailings for half a day. I mean, it was remarkable looking back. But the other thing I would say is there is an importance in considering your patrons. At the Y we have older patrons, programs that skew older in terms of our patronage, and I think that that's important to consider too. Is how are we reaching those folks who may need some support in the digital space and want that mailing, that brochure. So.
And that describes us. So we have an older audience at the Boulder Ensemble Theater Company. We do more mailings than anyone. We do postcard mailings, we do brochures, we do all of that. And we supplement that, of course, with all the digital mailings, emails as well. To answer the question, though, you have to give people something. I mean, why should I join this mailing list? And it's either going to be a premium of some sort, or it's going to be a well-done newsletter that keeps them informed about what's happening in the organization. And of course, you can't pound people with email after email after email. So there's a lot of tricks to getting people on the mailing list, but mostly have to give them something.
Do you remember, I mean, I don't know whether this happens the way it used to. I would tend to think not, but when you would contribute to a particular, I remember Amnesty International did this. They used to send out these really nice calendars with these incredible photos of the work that they're doing around the world, and you'd look forward to that because you'd actually use that calendar or put it up on your bulletin board or something.
Or bumper stickers, remember that?
Yeah. I don't think
Greenpeace or World Wildlife Federation, I remember some of those.
Right.
Iconic.
Yeah. I don't think that's that kind of practice isn't as popular as it was at one time.
I want to talk a little bit about the expense side of the equation for nonprofits right now. So there's a big trend right now of collaboration. Maya has talked a little bit about that, but how do we as nonprofits collaborate with one another to reduce, our expenses? So in the theater world, we occupy a theater at the Dairy Arts Center with local theater company and a few others. And we're now getting into this habit. Before we buy a piece of equipment, we go to our partners in this collaborative network and say, hey, do you have this $3,000 light that I could use? Now, can you all speak to that? Do you do this? Do you look at this collaboration from the expense side?
Sure. I mean, in terms of resourcing right now, our building is under construction. We're getting a big facelift, which is very exciting, but it means space for our ever-growing programs are limited to some extent, and it's a real challenge, right? And real estate in New York is really expensive. The cost of renting out additional office space, all of that. But our focus is, of course, particularly on the programming. And we've certainly reached out to kind of partnering organizations to think about opportunities to co-present some of our series where there is a shared mission or kind of discipline focus, and that's really been quite successful, I think, both in terms of, again, building this coalition of support, mutual support from, many peer organizations, but also in terms of reaching new audiences, folks who maybe attend a venue downtown that don't know about us, come and see that co-presenting label and then know about us. So I think there's benefits across the board.
Not my area.
I mean, the SCFD, 7-county metro district in Denver Metro, I don't want to say forces, but that, I guess it encourages and does in many ways based on the nonprofit directors that meet regularly, does force a certain amount of collaboration. My experience being the director of the Clifford Still Museum, again, a single artist museum that couldn't show and still can't show the work of any other artist, was greatly benefited by a very strong relationship we had with the Denver Art Museum. And it's not a coincidence that we built literally in the shadow of the Denver Art Museum, and that they would provide the context of all art history. And thankfully their directors over the many years were interested in collaborating with us as well. And then to your point about the expenses, what's been very successful here, and I assume elsewhere, is the ability to share those donor lists, or not donor lists, but participant lists. So if we're collaborating, we send it to our constituents, but also it goes to the partners' constituents as well. And so there's a kind of synergistic and, I think at the end of the day, it's very mission-centered. It's exactly what we're supposed to do. Although certainly some organizations are more collaborative than others, and some are extremely willing to, performing arts with scientific organizations. It's been really successful here.
I want to go back to what we talked about at the top of this meeting, which was kind of trends, but have any of your organizations gone through a crisis yet where Don't smile. What I mean is a crisis where you had to raise money quickly or you were going to shut down. Or can you speak to that? Has there, or what's the closest you've come to a crisis?
I mean, my whole career is focused on that. And largely because so much of the funding that I've worked with has been short-term, hasn't been sort of multiple-year fund. Ultimately, that's what you want, as a foundation or a funder to provide funding for multiple years. I mean, I'm the chair of an organization right now that benefited from one donor / foundation that gave us, I think, a 3 or 4 year grant that's coming to the end right now. And while we knew that from the very beginning, it's hard if you're doing the work every single day also to focus on diversifying your funding efforts, even though you know that there's an end to it. But we're at that point where we know, next year this funding isn't going to be there. And so this is, like where the rubber hits the road. How are we going? We'll have to shut down the organization if we can't get additional funding. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great that this organization funded us from the beginning, but it gives you kind of that license, I think, more mentally or emotionally to sort of sit back for a little while, and then it comes to the point where it's like, oh no, and there is, right now that kind of sense of urgency that we need to fill that gap.
Art museums go out of business all the time. I hate to say it, or museums. The 2007-8 Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, derivatives, whatever, 25 art museums in this country. This is just in the United States. And it's interesting, the laws, the rules in art museums is we cannot deaccession sell our collections for operations. And so in many cases, what's ironic is the institutions go out of business and then that collection is sold at auction and it's kind of a strange way that turns out. But during COVID, there was some relaxing of those rules by the Association of Art Museum Directors, which was a problematic decision for many. But there was a huge feeling, and particularly those who, some institutions would receive 50% of their funding from their benefit if they couldn't have a gathering and they couldn't raise it in the same way. It wasn't as impactful. I know of one institution that is probably in the process of going out of it, being absorbed by another. American Folk Art Museum in New York, I think, sold their building to MoMA, moved back to their smaller. I mean, it's how you're funded and what your business model is. But I hate to be flippant, it happens a lot.
Let's
also,
talk.
it can relate to particularly with foundations that, let's say, focus on a particular subject matter, and then something happens politically in the world, whether it's a new administration and people feel that we should focus on, threats to democracy or whatever, or COVID, and they completely pivot, and those organizations or beneficiaries that are focusing on something else then lose their funding because the foundation is focused on something new.
Let's just wrap up this conversation about trust and transparency, which are related, right? How transparent do we have to do when we demonstrate where the money of our donors is going? And how do we do that? Do we do that just simply through content? Do we do that reaching out individual to individual? Again, citing Charity Water, I love their model where the founder said 100% of the money we raise from you goes directly to water. It goes directly to drilling water. So how do you raise money for administration? We isolate that. That's an entirely different department. And what we do is we go out to high net worth individuals and they fund the administration. But for all of you who give $5 and $10, it goes directly. And then they are transparent in how they do that. And I'm wondering if you have anything similar to that, maybe starting with you, Maya. Is there a transparent?
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency is key to building trust with the public, with our foundations, with governments. I mean, that's essential, and particularly with the work we do serving students. I mean, it's a lot to track. I'll say that. I mean, transparency means data tracking, consistent evaluation, there's money and resources that go into that. But we love evaluation and we love data tracking on our team because we do want to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. What I will say, and this is a little bit off course here, but if I've learned anything from during my career in writing grants and working on a lot of grants, it's really read the fine print of what you're getting yourself into, because not every grant is an acceptable grant for the work, for your specific work or project. And grant money, I think, can often feel like this essential oxygen that drives the variety of your programs and your constituents, and that's true to some extent. But I think saying no is a powerful and important thing in this conversation. For example, when the reporting requirements are unreasonable and overly burdensome for the amount of the grant, that comes up for us. Some grants stipulate that money can only be used for certain new programs, and of course we want to fulfill that, but what if that program actually doesn't align with, what our department does best and forces us to sort of, fit a square peg into a round hole, so to speak. So I think it's about playing the long game, so to speak, making sure that, transparency is aligned with, wherever possible, longer term multi-year gifts that mean that, the work that you're putting in your reporting is building towards something larger and really supporting the program sustainability, as opposed to this, quick buck and then you do all this reporting that it's done.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of approach it from the other side of the coin as a donor, as a funder. I practice what's called trust-based philanthropy, and I do think that's possible because I think if you do your due diligence in researching who your beneficiary is, and there's enough information out there now, then you can. And sometimes it may come back and hit you in the backside, but generally for me it's been really positive, and if I'm going to fund an organization, I want to trust them, and I'll do whatever I need to make that happen. But for me, it's been a good approach.
Very quickly, and there's really no time for this, but in my museum studies class, I generated a discussion about our museum. Do museums have points of view? Can museums be neutral, particularly at this time? And I think we all know that museums are inherently liberal. We value freedom of expression. We are firmly against censorship in all of its forms. But boy, in the last 3 to 4 years, all of those things have been tested in ways that are going to affect our funding, our missions, our donors, and will become, I think, increasingly contested. So.
Yeah, no, I'm going to chime in on it really, really quickly, because when I was at
this is a whole nother panel.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. When I was at the Holocaust Museum, and we had this captive audience. Someone comes in the museum, you have them, and you go through this incredible, story about the Holocaust, and you come out and you think, what am I going to do? And we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars working with a PR firm on, Madison Avenue, saying, what is our logo? And the logo came up with, think about what you saw. And as an activist, I was just so offended about that, because I thought, here you have an opportunity, here you have this audience, and you're saying, think about what you saw instead of do something. But there was that fear, that you couldn't, jeopardize your constituent, your funding through offending one of your big donors or
yeah. We're right at the end of this session. I wanted to thank our panels, but before I do, there was one question we didn't get to. I wanted to get to them all, and it's a really good one, and I would suggest you come up, whoever asked the question, and I think all 3 of these panelists could help you. And the question was, can you talk about how a small arts organization can manage to function? And the example is a choir, a small choir. So I understand the question completely, and I thought, Dean, you would be a good person to talk about this, because you started by saying you had nothing when you started the museum. So whoever that was, I would come on up and ask that question. Can we thank the panel, please? Thank you so much. And also to the team here, the producers here at the conference as well. Just everything has been going so wonderfully. Thank you.